Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I would like to talk about this camera right here. It's the Nikon D600. Yes, it's been out for quite a while now, but I personally really enjoy using it, and for the price that you can get it for nowadays, I feel like it's kind of a bargain to get it as well if you're into Nikon DSLRs or just using older DSLRs in general, or just looking for like a really cheap, capable full-frame cameras to use that's also very durable and also reliable. So in this video I'll be breaking it down to three different sections, which is the ergonomics and operational side of things, then I'll do the image quality for both photography and video, and then into my conclusion. So let's just get into the video. So the Nikon D600, this camera came out quite a long time ago. I believe it was around 2012. Because I was still in middle school back then. But anyway, I think that despite the age, it's still a very capable camera. The 24 megapixels is great, the autofocusing system is really reliable, and you know, the ergonomics, the weather sealing is still all there, very good. And yeah, it just still has a lot of features that I think a lot of professional photographers can still use this camera and utilize it and produce great results with it. Or if you're just starting out in photography, I think that it's also a great option to really look for, because it is still full frame, and for the price range that you're getting it for, I think it's still kind of a bargain. And in this video, as mentioned earlier, I'll be breaking down to three different sections. The first one will be the ergonomics and the operational side of things, and then followed by the image quality for both video and photography. Well, photography first and then video, and then leading down to my conclusion. And let's first start with the ergonomics and the operational side of things. Well, this camera is actually built really solidly, and you know, when you press it really hard, you can't really put a dent to it really, like some other entry-level cameras when it's plastic. This is magnesium alloy, which is good. The ergonomics is great, though I wish the grip would be a little bit deeper and thicker, like the D300 line of cameras, the D500, because those cameras are actually quite nice and thick, and you can just grip it longer if you're shooting with this camera for a long period of time. This thin and not so deep grip can actually hurt your wrist a little bit, but of course this really depends on how big your hands or your palm size is, because even for my medium-sized hands, I find it for like a long period of shooting time, it can be a little bit painful on the wrist because of how not really that comfortable the grip here is. I just wish it's a little bit deeper and maybe a tiny bit thicker. But otherwise, everything else is pretty great. I like how there are these dividers for the ports, because you know, some cameras you have to pull all of the flap open, and with this one it's very nicely organized, because on the top you have the microphone and the headphone jack port, and then you have the essential media port like the file transfer, the HDMI, and then a completely separate mini port just for the remote, which is great because I also love using intervalometer and I like shooting with remotes as well, and that's great. At the back you'll find really nice LCD screen, though I find it a little bit too contrasty, so if you're shooting in areas where there are a lot of high contrast, just be aware that when you go home you'll get a much more detailed image, simply because the contrast on the screen here is just so high that sometimes you feel like certain details are actually being washed out or being faded away with the shadows. But otherwise the screen is really great because it's bright enough to see in the sunlight, which means you still can really judge your images, your colors and things like that, even in bright sunlight, which is good. The downside about the back panel here is actually the ISO button. I don't understand why it has to be down here, why it can't be somewhere up here or up here in the control dial like in other Nikon cameras, let's say the D300 lines again, or the D500, or even the D800 line of cameras. You know, you have your ISO control up here as well, which is great, but on this D600 line of cameras it's way down here, which can be very annoying depending on what you're shooting and the speed of your shooting pace. But if you're kind of person who just uses auto ISO, then you know, you can just ignore this button and ignore my little complaint right there. The viewfinder is great, it's 100% accurate, but it's not as big as some other cameras, of course, but it will still get the job done. The only downside is, well, it's a little bit flush to the body, because there is this hump right here from the display, and having this viewfinder that's already kind of flushed towards the body, your nose is going to be really squashed up to the screen, and that's not really pleasant feeling, especially if you're shooting for a long period of time using the viewfinder. So yeah, but if you're one of those people who just uses the live view feature, then it's also completely okay. You will not be using the viewfinder. Just know that the high contrast still applies even in live view, and also the autofocusing system is a little bit slower in live view, but it is manageable. And yeah, now moving on to the battery life. The battery life on here is actually pretty great, though not always consistent. I do replace my batteries every now and then. I'm one of those people who replace their batteries every 1.5 years, so that the battery remains, you know, up to like almost the full cycle as it was brand new. And yeah, so it will just always be as consistent as possible. But this camera's battery is not always consistent, because sometimes it just shows you it has 50% left, but in some occasions, and this is just some occasions, in order to bring down from 50 to 0, it's just going to be like a couple of hours of shoot. So just keep that in mind, and I do highly recommend bringing like extra batteries. Of course, it's not like an entry-level mirrorless cameras where battery will just drain very quickly. The battery on here overall, if you start with 100%, it will last you several days. Of course, depending on what you shoot. If you shoot videos, then it will just last you a couple of hours as well, because video is very demanding, but more on that in a bit. The media storage card, it takes 2 SD cards, which I personally don't like. A lot of people prefer this, and I can see why. I just prefer CF cards. But of course, adding CF cards into this camera will make this camera thicker, because SD cards, well, dual SD cards will just occupy less space than dual CF cards. And yeah, that's for the media storage. I love the screen up here. I always love cameras with screen up here, whether it's DSLRs or mirrorless, because it just gives you a quick information to your shooting modes and what your shooting settings really are. And yeah, this camera, despite being a full-frame camera, it also has flash, which is great, and having a flash that's really high above the lens also means that if you're shooting a lot in low-light situation with portraits as well, you're able to eliminate a lot of the red eye issue as well, though you can also easily correct that in post. But you know, if you don't like to spend extra time in post, then having the flash raised a little bit further from the lens like this camera is also a welcome feature. Another point I really love about this camera is how quickly you can switch between live view and video mode. It's just kind of like the earlier Canon 7D style, where there was just this lever here, or lever, that you can just toggle between photography and filmmaking mode or video mode, and just press live view to, oh, it's on. Yeah, it's actually really quickly to respond. I didn't know it was on. But anyway, you can just, yeah, toggle between the two, and it's just really responsive, and the settings will just be saved differently between photography mode and filmmaking mode. So yeah, that's actually pretty good for a lot of people. Personally, for me, I find it best to have the photography mode the same settings as the video mode, apart from the picture profile. But that's just me nitpicking, simply because the picture profile in photography is very different from the picture profile you should be using for video, because for video photography, picture profile actually adds too much digital sharpening, which this camera actually has very ugly digital sharpening. So if you do shoot in video, do turn the sharpening all the way down. And if you want to sharpen it later, you can still sharpen it in post, which makes it look more natural, because the internal sharpening here with the digital sharpening is very amateur look, so to speak. Then my next point is the autofocusing system in this camera. It's actually very accurate for the price point that you can get it for nowadays, and also for the age of the camera as well. But it's kind of clustered in the middle, and I think you heard a lot of these complaints in other videos, but it is kind of clustered in the middle. That said, it is still quick and accurate, but the layout of the AF points is also like spread out, that it actually covers the basic zone of rule of thirds. So in my experience, it still covers the basic general photography field without having to do a lot of focus and recompose, which is nice. But in low light, don't expect a lot of performance out of the AF, especially if you turn off the AF assist light, because in low lighting situation, it's actually not going to be reliable. And if it confirms that it's in focus, please do focus it like twice or thrice, simply because it can be just slightly off, like a hair off. So yeah, that's really the main weakness, is that it's not really that good in low light situations with the AF system. For tracking sports though, assuming you have perfect lighting situation, it will get the job done. Unless if the subject is running towards the camera or walking towards the camera, that's when this camera and pretty much most other cameras will have problem with. But otherwise, you can rely, I think, 80% or 75% on the autofocusing system of this camera, which actually is pretty good. And another point now is naturally the frames per second. This camera can shoot at 5.5 frames per second, though depending on the autofocusing system, it might not always catch up to 5.5 frames per second. It can be up to 4 frames per second or even 3.5 frames per second, depending on, you know, how accurate you want the subject to be in focus, because a lot of times if the camera cannot confirm things in AI servo to be in focus, then, you know, it will just try to hunt first before always track, hunt, track, and focus and everything. So yeah, it really depending on your subject that you're actually photographing. But in most situations, it will get it around 5 frames per second. And if you're shooting in RAW, I believe it goes up to around 14 frames per second, 14 images before it actually starts to buffer. And yeah, that should get you a little bit of room to actually photograph sports and moving portraits or moving subjects. So yeah, that's actually quite nice. If you're a JPEG person, I believe it shoots all the way up to 28 or almost 30 pictures before it actually starts to slow down and write to the card. So yeah, just be careful on what you're photographing. But I think that for most general purpose of photography or field of photography, it's definitely more than enough. And another point I find really nice about this camera is, even though this camera doesn't have, you know, NFC, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, you can actually buy this really cheap module that plugs into the side of the camera, and you can just wirelessly transfer your images, things like that, to your smartphone, which is great, especially for this kind of camera. Because whether if you're working professionally with this camera or if you're just, you know, taking it on holidays or what have you, it's always nice to be able to just transfer your images wirelessly to your phone and share it with your friends or your audience, or just work on it right away rather than having it sitting in the camera and just do it the old-fashioned way of putting the memory card to your computer and transferring it there, or to your iPad or whatever, because it's another cumbersome step to actually, you know, take it out, and you might lose your card, things like that. And SD cards are very small and you can lose them. So yeah. And now into the image quality, as the construction sites outside are actually starting to work. And I'm sorry if you're hearing some drilling noises. I can't stop the construction site outside, but yeah, the image quality on this camera is actually quite nice. I love the dynamic range, I love the color signs, I love the color reproduction, I love the rendition of the color depth and everything. It's just a really nice camera to use. The only downside about the color signs, well, it's not really about the color signs, but it's really about how the camera judges the white balance. If you're using auto white balance on here, the white balance can be actually quite messed up and all over the place from time to time. Not always, just from time to time. But if you're shooting raw like me, then you can always fix that later in post, because all of the raw data will be saved into the raw file anyway. So yeah, but otherwise, if you're just working with this file from this camera, I think even for today's standards, the colors, the depth, the dynamic range is just really nice. And even though it's an old camera, but the dynamic range is still pretty good. And if it's not enough for you, then just take bracketed shots. But yeah, it's a really nice camera to still use, and I find that it renders complex skin tones really nicely as well. And even if you're shooting at night, it doesn't really mess up with a lot of different shades of lighting or shades of colors from different lighting. So yeah, it's overall a very nice camera that actually still produces really nice images, though I wouldn't use really high ISO on here. Just like any older DSLRs, the higher ISO actually still produces a lot of noise, though this camera isn't really that bad. But you know, I wouldn't really go above, let's say, 1600 ISO on here or 2000 ISO on here. And if you do go around like higher than those ISO settings, I wouldn't recommend recovering a lot of shadows either, simply because it will definitely show a lot of noise, and also it will just create a lot of this softness on the image, even if you turn off the noise reduction on the images. So yeah, but of course, having 24 megapixels, you can easily clean up some of the noise later in post by trading in some of the resolution. So if you're really only uploading to your social media, let's say to Facebook, Instagram, Flickr, what have you, then because by the nature of the resolution that's very low on those sites, you can easily just trade your 24 megapixels in your Lightroom or your other editing software for some denoising, and your images will still look really fine and amazing on those platforms. And now to the video side of things, and let me first actually talk about the most negative point I find about using this camera before going into the positive things. The most negative thing I find about this camera is actually the aperture control. You cannot control your aperture when in video mode. If there's a way around it, like that I can actually use that directly in video mode, please let me know, because I really don't know. Usually I have to exit the live view mode or exit the video mode and then be able to change my aperture and then go back into the video mode and see my aperture there, which actually is very cumbersome and very frustrating, because sometimes you just want to capture something really quickly, spontaneously. And of course, I like shooting in manual mode in video, because the automatic mode here on this camera in video mode is just kind of all over the place as well. So that's why I like shooting in manual mode on this camera in video settings, of course. And not being able to change the aperture is really annoying, because I have missed a lot of spontaneous moments, captures in the past. So another downside on this camera is the moire and aliasing. Yes, naturally, because it's an older camera at kind of like a semi-professional range, the moire and aliasing control is not that great. It was really good at the time when it came out, but with more modern cameras being much better to control moire and aliasing, it just makes this camera look kind of bad. And for video, if you're shooting a lot of fine patterns, I would not recommend this camera. But otherwise, into the positive thing, if you're not shooting a lot of fine patterns and details, things like that, then I would recommend this camera, because the actual video coming out of this camera is still great. You can tweak a lot, quite a bit with the video files, that it will not really fall apart, which is great. You still can use it for events, you still can use it for studio work, you can use it for travel video. Just keep in mind that it doesn't have any proper autofocusing system to rely on for video. So but otherwise it's a nice video camera as well, because the color science, the color profile, the color depth of this is just really nice. And you still can, as I mentioned earlier, tweak with the colors coming out of this camera, though you can also just create your own kind of picture profile that you can shoot flat or neutral with it, so giving you more room to even do more color editing and color correction later in post. And of course, if you're doing a lot of interview videos, apart from the fact that you might have to tell your talent not to wear like many patterns kind of clothing, you actually can monitor your audio with your headphone jack, which is really nice, especially for the price point of this camera. But otherwise, that's pretty much it about the video side of things. Now into the conclusion. And overall, I really love this camera, and if you're starting out with full frame, I would still recommend this camera. I got mine for around 300 euros, and it's really going between 300 and 400 euros, give or take, depending on the region of the world you actually live in, because right now, if you live in like Southeast Asia, it can be much cheaper. If you live in Europe, I got mine for, as I mentioned, 300 euros. To be honest, it was originally 330 euros, but it was on eBay for quite a while, and the owner just really wanted to get rid of it, so they just slammed the 30 euros discount on this camera, and yeah, I got the camera for 300 euros. And yeah, this camera essentially already has all the core features and everything what you need for both photography and video into this camera. And let's say if you're spending around 350 euros on this camera already, it only takes up to like a few hundred euros more to spend on like proper good, maybe secondhand lenses to get onto this camera, or a few primes as well, and it will just produce really nice images. And yeah, you can't really go wrong with it. Sure, in video it's still frustrating with the aperture settings, but other than that, I think you can really produce some really quality results with this camera. And on top of that, because it's a very reliable camera and it's also weather sealed, you can actually take it to many places that you go to. And also for the fact that this camera is actually quite light as well, well, in my opinion, it's actually quite light, it's actually even easier to actually travel with this camera. So yeah, for the price point, for the fact that it's full frame, and for the fact that the color science is actually still pretty good, there's weather sealing, there's really high reliability rate. It's just a camera that you can actually just take with you wherever you want it to go. And yeah, it will just not really fail on you. And that's just a nice camera to have. And of course, having just the core essential features in photography without any extra fancy features, you can just really focus on taking your pictures just down to the core essentials and just focus on the moments, on the composition, on the story, on your creativity, what have you, rather than thinking about, okay, this camera has this feature or this camera has that feature, I can just use it to capture this and that kind of images. So rather than having just like a technically looking picture, you can actually have like a more meaningful conceptualized picture, because you're not just going to be distracted by other things, and that's pretty good. And being a camera that still delivers good results even for modern day standards, it just ensures that your creativity, your work, your results will just still look really amazing coming out of this camera. And 24 megapixels isn't that little, you know. Sure, nowadays there are cameras with 50 megapixels, 100 megapixels, but 24 megapixels still gets you like even A1 size print fully fine, and also will still get you really fine crop as well, should you wish to crop and still see a lot of detail. And because of the dynamic range of this camera, you still will see a lot of detail and be able to recover a lot of shadows in normal lighting situation without introducing a lot of noise into the image. So yeah, just take it for what it is. The viewfinder, despite being flashed back, it's still an accurate 100% viewfinder. The only other downside about this camera that I find, apart from the ones that I already said in the video, is that this camera only goes up to 4,000th of a second shutter speed, of course, whereas I would really love it to go around 8,000th of a second, because if you're using primes, let's say f1.8, f1.4, f1.2, if you have it, it's really hard to find a good shutter speed for it, especially for outdoor in bright sunlight, because there will be time that you want to shoot portraits, let's say in f1.4, f1.8, and 4,000th of a second is just not high enough. So that's the only thing that you might have to consider. If that's a deal breaker to you, then maybe the D700 or the D800 or the D810 secondhand might be a better option. Just save a little bit more, because let's say the D800 is also around 350 euros, 450 euros, depending on the condition. The D810 is around 600, 700 euros as of the time of recording. On average price, of course, it can be a bit lower or a bit higher, depending on the region of the world that you live in, and the shutter count and the condition. But yeah, that's it about this camera. I still highly recommend this camera if you're looking for like full frame cameras to get into or to start your photography with on a cheap that actually has a lot of the even more modern features as well, because this camera has sensor cleaning. This D700 doesn't, so it's very similar price point, but if you can spend a bit more, get this one because live view, sensor cleaning, more modern sensors, better in low light. Even for modern day standards, it's still pretty good in low light. So yeah, reliable autofocusing system, and yeah, I'm just repeating myself right now, but yeah, it's just a nice camera to have in your bag. So yeah, that's it for this video. If you need a free photography guidebook, the link is down in the description section below. It's absolutely for free, no need to submit your email address, nothing. I will not bombard you with any newsletter nonsense. So yeah, if you have any questions or anything to add, please feel free to comment in the comment section down below. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.